Chapter 1. A War Won, a Mate Found. The battlefield was eerily silent, save for the distant crackling of dying flames. The metallic scent of blood and burnt flesh lingered in the cold night air. Lucian Blackwood, Alpha of the Silver Crescent Pack, stood in the wreckage, his golden eyes scanning the carnage. His warriors had won. Their enemies lay defeated, their territory secured. Victory should have brought him satisfaction. Instead, he felt empty. Lucian exhaled sharply, running a blood-stained hand through his damp hair. He had spent years waiting for his mate, someone strong, someone worthy, someone who would be the perfect Luna. That dream had kept him alive through countless battles. His beta, Adrian Vaughn, approached, his expression tense. Lucian. The elders. They feel the bond snap into place. Lucian's breath hitched. Finally. His heart pounded as he urged his horse forward, anticipation coiling in his chest. His mate, his Luna, was waiting. He envisioned a beautiful, powerful Omega with a strong wolf and a scent that would soothe him. The moment he crossed into his pack's territory, he felt it, a bond forming, raw and undeniable. But when his golden gaze fell upon Elijah Hale, his entire world shattered. A beta. Not an Omega. Not the soft, submissive mate he had dreamed of. Elijah stood in the center of the gathered pack, arms crossed, blue eyes burning with defiance. His dark hair was tousled, his stance rigid. He wasn't even a wolf. Lucian's stomach twisted. This wasn't right. This is a mistake, Lucian snarled, his voice sharp. Elijah's lips curled into a humorless smirk. You think I don't know that? His voice was low, edged with bitterness. I didn't ask for this. Lucian clenched his fists. You don't belong here. Elijah took a step forward, gaze unyielding. Then reject me. Silence. Lucian's wolf howled in protest, his chest tightening. Reject him? The thought alone sent a painful pulse through his veins. Lucian's voice faltered. I can't. Elijah exhaled harshly, shaking his head. Figures. His expression softened, though his frustration remained. Look, neither of us wanted this. But here we are. So what now? Lucian's jaw tightened. He had no answer. But one thing was certain, Elijah was his mate. And there was no escaping it. Chapter 2. A Bond Neither Wants. The tension between them was suffocating. The pack was watching, waiting for their alpha's decision. But Lucian couldn't bring himself to speak. His mother had told him that when he met his mate, everything would make sense. Yet, nothing about this felt right. Elijah, however, was unaffected. So what's the plan, Alpha? He asked, arms still crossed. His tone was casual, almost mocking. Are we just going to stand here, or do you want to lock me up somewhere until you figure out what to do with me? Lucian growled. Don't test me, Beta. Elijah huffed out a laugh. Oh, trust me. That's the last thing I want to do. His smirk faded. I just want to go home. Lucian's wolf snarled at the thought. Home? Where? Outside the pack. The bond wouldn't allow it. You're staying, Lucian said firmly. Elijah's entire body stiffened. Excuse me. You're my mate, whether I want it or not. Lucian's voice was clipped, controlled. You're not leaving. Elijah's eyes narrowed. So what? You want me to stay here, in a pack where I don't belong, with an alpha who hates me. His voice was sharp, but there was something else beneath it, something almost vulnerable. Lucian hesitated. You'll be given quarters in the packhouse. We'll figure this out. Elijah scoffed. You mean you'll figure out how to reject me without killing yourself in the process? Lucian's fists clenched. Damn him. He hated how easily Elijah saw through him. The beta turned away, running a hand through his hair. Fine. I'll stay. But don't expect me to play along with this mate bond nonsense. Lucian didn't respond. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked away, ignoring the way his wolf howled in protest. Chapter 3. Bound by Fate. The room assigned to Elijah was luxurious, but he didn't care. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the intricate carvings on the wooden walls. He didn't belong here. He wasn't supposed to be here. A knock on the door made him tense. Before he could respond, Lucian entered, his golden gaze unreadable. "We need to talk," the Alpha said. Elijah crossed his arms. "About what? How much you regret this?" Lucian's jaw ticked. "This isn't about regrets. It's about what happens next." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly do you expect from me?" Lucian stepped closer, and for the first time, Elijah felt the raw intensity of his mate's presence. God, he was big, strong, commanding. "I don't know," Lucian admitted, voice quieter. Elijah swallowed hard, caught in the golden fire of Lucian's gaze. Why did it feel like he was burning under his stare? Lucian exhaled. "The bond is real. We can't change that." Elijah's breath hitched when Lucian's fingers brushed his wrist. It was the lightest touch, but it sent a jolt of warmth up his arm. Too much. Too soon. He yanked his hand away. "Don't do that." Lucian frowned. "Do what?" "Look at me like that." Elijah's voice was barely above a whisper. Lucian studied him for a long moment before stepping back. "Get some rest." And just like that, he was gone, leaving Elijah to deal with the unbearable weight of the bond alone. Chapter 4. Cracks in the Armor. The days that followed were filled with tension. Lucian avoided Elijah as much as possible, while Elijah tried to act like he didn't care. But then came the first pack gathering. Elijah was forced to stand beside Lucian, the weight of judgmental gazes pressing down on him. "Try to act like you belong here," Lucian murmured, his breath ghosting against Elijah's ear. A shiver ran down Elijah's spine. "I don't." Lucian's golden eyes darkened. "You're mine, Elijah." Elijah's breath caught. "Then prove it." Lucian didn't hesitate. He cupped Elijah's chin, tilting his head up, and kissed him. The bond ignited between them, scorching, undeniable. And for the first time, Elijah felt everything. Chapter 5. A Kiss That Changes Everything. Elijah's world spun as Lucian's lips moved against his, firm yet surprisingly controlled. It wasn't desperate, wasn't possessive, it was calculated. A show for the pack, a claim. And yet, heat coiled in Elijah's stomach, his body betraying him as his hands instinctively gripped Lucian's broad shoulders. He could feel the way the Alpha's muscles tensed beneath his fingers, the warmth radiating from his body. Lucian pulled away, golden eyes blazing. "There. Now no one will question your place." Elijah's breath was uneven. "So that's all this was? A show?" Lucian exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "What else would it be?" Something bitter curled in Elijah's chest, but he quickly shoved it down. Of course. It was just for the pack. It didn't matter that his skin still tingled where Lucian had touched him. "Right," Elijah said, forcing a smirk. "Wouldn't want your warriors thinking their Alpha actually likes his mate." Lucian stiffened, his gaze flickering to Elijah's lips before quickly looking away. "Go to your chambers." Elijah rolled his eyes. "Yes, Alpha." His voice dripped with sarcasm, but he still turned on his heel and walked away. Lucian's gaze burned into his back the entire time. Chapter 6. Dangerous Proximity. Elijah was not avoiding Lucian. He just had better things to do than deal with his insufferable mate. But Lucian, apparently, had other plans. Elijah was in the training grounds, watching the warriors spar, when he felt him. The heat of his presence, the intensity of his gaze. Even without looking, Elijah could tell Lucian was close. Too close. "You shouldn't be here," Lucian murmured, his breath ghosting against Elijah's ear. Elijah shivered. "Damn it. I'm not hurting anyone," he said, forcing himself to stay still. Lucian's fingers brushed his wrist, just a whisper of contact, but it sent a jolt through Elijah's entire body. "You're distracting them," Lucian said, his voice low. "And me." Elijah's breath hitched. Lucian had moved even closer, his chest almost pressing against Elijah's back. "He's doing this on purpose," Elijah said, tilting his head slightly, his lips almost brushing Lucian's jaw. "Not my fault you can't control yourself." Lucian's golden eyes darkened. His grip on Elijah's wrist tightened just enough to make him aware of the strength behind it. "Careful," Lucian murmured. "You don't want to play a game you can't win." Elijah smirked. "Who says I'm playing?" Lucian let go, stepping back abruptly. Without another word, he walked away, leaving Elijah with a racing heart and the unmistakable smell of arousal lingering in the air. Chapter 7. The first touch that lingers too long. Elijah hated formal dinners. He hated them even more when he had to sit beside Lucian, forced into his role as the Alpha's mate. The table was filled with high-ranking pack members, their eyes flicking between Lucian and Elijah with curiosity. Some were skeptical, others judgmental. Lucian, ever the perfect Alpha, acted as if nothing was wrong. But Elijah? He was on edge. Halfway through the meal, he felt it, Lucian's hand on his thigh. Elijah's entire body stiffened. Lucian didn't react, continuing his conversation with the elders as if he wasn't touching Elijah. It wasn't a possessive grip. It wasn't demanding. It was casual. But the warmth of Lucian's palm seeped through the fabric of Elijah's pants, burning into his skin. Lucian's thumb moved. Just a slow, absent-minded stroke against Elijah's thigh. "Shit." Elijah swallowed, refusing to react. If Lucian wanted to play this game, fine. Slowly, deliberately, Elijah shifted, pressing his leg against Lucian's. Lucian tensed for a fraction of a second before turning his head slightly, golden eyes locking onto Elijah's. A challenge. Elijah's lips curled into a smirk. Lucian smirked back. Neither moved away. Neither looked away. The tension sat thick between them, an unspoken war that neither was willing to lose. Chapter 8. A challenge met with fire. That night, Elijah found himself unable to sleep. Lucian had barely looked at him after dinner. No taunts, no snide comments. Just silence. So why did he feel this? The air was too thick, his skin too hot. He hated this bond. A knock on the door made him sit up. Before he could even respond, Lucian walked in, closing the door behind him. Elijah raised an eyebrow. Not even a "may I come in?" Lucian didn't answer. Instead, he stalked forward, stopping just short of Elijah's bed. "You're testing me," Lucian said, voice rough. Elijah leaned back against the pillows. "Am I?" Lucian exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "You don't understand what you're doing." Elijah tilted his head, his voice dropping into something softer, something dangerous. "Then explain it to me." Lucian moved. One knee on the bed, his hands on either side of Elijah's hips. Not touching. Just hovering. Close enough that Elijah could feel the heat radiating off his body, could see the way his golden eyes flickered between frustration and something darker. Something hungry. Elijah's breath hitched. Lucian's gaze dropped to his lips. For one breath, neither of them moved. For one breath, the only sound in the room was their uneven breathing. Then, just as quickly as he had moved, Lucian pulled away. "I won't do this," he muttered, standing. "Not like this." Elijah's heart pounded. "Coward." Lucian stiffened. But he left without another word. Elijah let out a shaky breath, pressing a hand to his chest. This was getting dangerous. Chapter 9. A dance between fire and ice. The next morning, Lucian acted as if nothing had happened. Elijah was done playing it safe. When they walked past each other in the halls, Elijah brushed too close. When Lucian trained, Elijah watched, lips slightly parted, gaze heated. When Lucian spoke to him, Elijah held his gaze just a second too long. Every little action was a challenge. And Lucian felt it. His control slipped, little by little, until finally he snapped. Elijah was pinned against the wall, Lucian's breath hot against his neck. "You want to play games?" Lucian growled. Elijah smirked, his own breathing uneven. "I want to see if you'll actually do something about it." Lucian leaned in. His lips brushed Elijah's jaw, lingering, too light to be a kiss, too heavy to ignore. Elijah's hands clenched. "Do it." Lucian pulled away. Elijah cursed. "This bastard." Lucian smirked, eyes dark with satisfaction. "I told you," Lucian murmured. "You don't know what you're doing." And then he was gone, leaving Elijah burning. Chapter 10. A game played too well. Elijah was done waiting. Lucian had spent the past few weeks teasing him, challenging him, and then pulling away before anything could happen. It was infuriating. The Alpha thought he had all the control, thought Elijah would just sit there and squirm under his silent dominance. Well, not anymore. If Lucian wanted a game, Elijah would win. The perfect opportunity came that night. The pack was celebrating a successful hunt, and wine flowed freely. Lucian was seated at the head of the table, watching over his wolves with a quiet intensity. He looked untouchable, golden eyes sharp beneath the dim firelight, his dark tunic stretched tight over his broad chest. Elijah took his time crossing the room. Slow, deliberate steps. He knew Lucian was watching. He could feel his gaze, heavy and dark, like a storm waiting to break. He stopped just beside Lucian, reaching for the wine jug. He made a show of pouring himself a drink, his movements too slow, too precise. Then, without hesitation, Elijah sat in Lucian's lap. The entire table went silent. Lucian stiffened beneath him. Every single muscle in the Alpha's body locked into place. His hands gripped the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Elijah took a slow sip of wine. Then he tilted his head, letting the firelight catch his smirk. "Comfortable, Alpha?" Lucian's jaw ticked. "What are you doing?" Elijah leaned back slightly, shifting in Lucian's lap like he was testing the fit. He could feel the sharp inhale the Alpha took, could feel the way his muscles flexed beneath him. "Making myself at home," Elijah said casually, resting one hand on Lucian's shoulder. He leaned in, close enough that his breath ghosted against Lucian's ear. "Unless that's a problem?" Lucian growled. The sound was low, warning, but Elijah wasn't afraid. If anything, it only made him bolder. Elijah let his fingers drift, just a light touch along the back of Lucian's neck, his nails scraping lightly against the skin. Lucian shuddered. It was small, barely noticeable, but Elijah caught it. He smirked. Lucian's hand shot out, gripping Elijah's waist. His fingers dug in, holding him still. "Get off." Elijah tilted his head, eyes gleaming. "Make me." Lucian's fingers tightened. For a moment, it seemed like he actually might throw Elijah over his shoulder and drag him out of the hall. But he didn't, because that would mean losing. Elijah leaned in closer, pressing his lips just near Lucian's ear. "Thought so." Then, just as casually as he'd sat down, Elijah stood, taking his wine with him. He didn't even look back as he strolled away. But he felt it. Lucian's rage. His frustration. His hunger. Checkmate. Chapter 11. The Alpha finally bites back. Lucian didn't come looking for him that night, which was annoying. Elijah had fully expected the Alpha to storm into his room, pin him against a wall, and finally do something about all this tension. But no. Lucian was a coward. So Elijah decided to push harder. The next day, he found Lucian in the training grounds, sparring with some of his top warriors. The Alpha was shirtless, muscles glistening with sweat, his body moving like a predator in perfect control. Elijah should not have been watching this closely. But he did. He leaned against a nearby post, arms crossed, blatantly staring. Lucian noticed. His movements became sharper, rougher. His strikes more aggressive, his control slipping. When the fight ended, Lucian wiped the sweat from his face and turned toward Elijah, golden eyes burning. Elijah just smirked. Lucian stormed toward him, stopping too close, their bodies almost brushing. "You think this is funny?" Lucian growled. Elijah tilted his head. Innocent. "I have no idea what you mean." Lucian exhaled sharply, his jaw tight. Then, so fast Elijah barely had time to react, Lucian grabbed his wrist and yanked him forward. Elijah's back hit a wooden pillar, Lucian's body pressing right up against him. Elijah's breath hitched. Lucian's eyes flicked to his lips. Then, he leaned in. Elijah's heart pounded. For a split second, he thought Lucian was actually going to do it, actually going to kiss him. But then, Lucian smirked and pulled away. Elijah blinked, stunned. You? Lucian laughed. Not so fun when it's done to you, is it? The Alpha murmured, his breath warm against Elijah's cheek. Elijah scowled. Bastard. Lucian just chuckled and walked away. Elijah hated how much he liked it. Chapter 12. The Breaking Point. 4 days, the game continued. Elijah would push. Lucian would push back, neither willing to break first. It was exhausting. And then, one night, everything snapped. A storm raged outside, thunder shaking the walls of the packhouse. Elijah couldn't sleep. He paced his chambers, frustration coiling inside him. And then, Lucian was there. Soaking wet from the rain, golden eyes burning with something dark. Elijah barely had time to speak before Lucian was on him. A hand in his hair. A grip on his hip. Lips barely brushing, but never quite touching. Lucian was teasing him, punishing him, letting their bodies almost align, letting their breaths mingle, but never giving Elijah what he wanted. Elijah's hands clawed at Lucian's shoulders. Stop playing with me. Lucian exhaled, forehead pressing against Elijah's. You started this. Elijah's breath came fast, his body on fire. Then end it. Lucian's grip tightened, and this time, he didn't pull away. Chapter 16. Breaking the Last Barrier. Elijah didn't know how long they stayed like that, wrapped in each other's heat, breathing the same air. Lucian's hands moved over his back, his touch firm, steady, grounding. Elijah should have felt overwhelmed, should have pushed him away. But he didn't. Lucian's lips brushed against his throat, his shoulder, his jaw, every touch like a silent promise. I want you to understand something, Lucian murmured, voice low. His golden eyes locked onto Elijah's, and something in them made Elijah's chest tighten. This isn't just desire. It's not just instinct. Elijah swallowed hard, his fingers trembling against Lucian's chest. Then what is it? He whispered. Lucian leaned in, his lips hovering over Elijah's, not quite touching. Everything. And then he closed the distance. This time, the kiss wasn't hesitant. It wasn't teasing. It was claiming. Lucian's arms tightened around him, pulling Elijah fully against him, chest to chest, heartbeat against heartbeat. Elijah could feel the power in him, the quiet strength he always carried. But more than that, he felt the vulnerability. Lucian kissed him like he was something he'd been starving for. Like he couldn't breathe without him. And Elijah kissed him back like he never wanted to stop. Chapter 17. The world comes crashing back. Lucian didn't let Elijah go that night. They stayed wrapped in the silence, in the warmth of each other's bodies, until the first light of dawn crept through the curtains. And then, reality came knocking. A sharp knock at the door shattered the quiet. Elijah. It was Kieran. Elijah jerked upright, heart hammering. He was still pressed against Lucian, the Alpha's arms wrapped possessively around him. Lucian's eyes flashed. He tightened his hold slightly, as if daring Elijah to move away. Elijah, Kieran called again, voice impatient. Open up. Lucian growled. Actually growled. Elijah shot him a look, whispering, seriously. Lucian smirked, unapologetic. Shaking his head, Elijah quickly pulled away and adjusted his tunic, trying to make himself look at least somewhat presentable. When he opened the door, Kieran's eyes narrowed. You look, Kieran's gaze flicked over him. Different. Elijah crossed his arms. What do you want? The council is calling for you, Kieran said. Something about your role as Luna. Elijah felt the blood drain from his face. Lucian tensed behind him. They what? Kieran sighed, rubbing his temples. They're demanding an audience with both of you. Now. Lucian's golden gaze darkened. He had known this was coming. But he hadn't expected it to be so soon. Chapter 18. The Weight of a Title. The council hall was packed when they arrived. Elders lined the long stone table, their eyes sharp and judging. The weight of their gazes pressed down on Elijah like 1,000 stones. Lucian stood at his side, tall, composed, but seething. "You have taken a human as your Luna," one of the elders stated. "Not a question. A fact." Elijah's jaw tightened. "I'm not human," he said, voice even. "I'm a beta." An elder scoffed. "A beta is not an omega. A Luna should be a proper mate." A low, menacing growl rumbled from Lucian's chest, making the entire room fall silent. Elijah glanced at him. Lucian's golden eyes burned with barely restrained rage. "This is not up for debate," Lucian said, voice cold and final. "Elijah is mine." One of the elders looked unimpressed. "If your bond is real, then prove it." Elijah blinked. "Excuse me." The elder's gaze was unrelenting. "If he is your Luna, he should carry your scent. Your mark." Elijah's pulse spiked. Lucian's expression darkened. It was a direct challenge. Elijah's hand clenched at his side. He wasn't an object to be proven. And then, Lucian did something that made everyone freeze. Without warning, he turned to Elijah and kissed him. Right there, in front of everyone. Not a soft kiss. Not a light touch. But a claiming. The room fell dead silent. When Lucian finally pulled back, his voice was like steel. "Is that enough proof for you?" Chapter 19. A Storm on the Horizon. After the council meeting, the entire pack was buzzing. Everyone had seen it. There was no more denying their bond. But even as the pack whispered about it, even as eyes followed Elijah everywhere, something else was happening. Something darker. One night, Kieran stormed into Lucian's chambers, grim-faced. "There's been an attack," he said. Lucian's body went rigid. Elijah's stomach dropped. "What?" Kieran's eyes flicked to Elijah before settling back on Lucian. "The northern border. It's them." Lucian's expression was lethal. He didn't need to ask who them was. It was their enemies. And they had finally made their move. Chapter 20. The Calm Before the Storm. That night, Elijah lay awake. Lucian sat at the edge of the bed, his back to him, his shoulders tense. The war was coming. Elijah knew what that meant. Lucian would have to fight. And for the first time, Elijah wasn't sure if he could handle watching him walk into battle. Slowly, he crawled across the bed and pressed his forehead against Lucian's bare back. Lucian stilled. "Elijah." "I don't care about the title," Elijah whispered. "I don't care what the council says. I don't care about proving anything." Lucian turned slightly, looking down at him. Elijah swallowed hard. "Just come back to me." Lucian's gaze softened. And then, without a word, he pulled Elijah into his arms, holding him so tightly it was almost painful. "I will," Lucian murmured. And Elijah prayed he would. Chapter 21. The Battlefield Calls. The morning of battle came too fast. Lucian was already armored when Elijah woke up. His golden eyes were calm, but Elijah knew him well enough now to see the tension beneath the surface. Lucian stood near the window, watching the horizon, where smoke was beginning to rise. "They've crossed the border," Kieran reported from the doorway. "It's time." Elijah's stomach twisted. He pushed off the bed and crossed the room in seconds, grabbing Lucian's wrist. Lucian turned to him, and for the first time, there was something raw in his gaze, something he wasn't trying to hide. Elijah's fingers tightened around Lucian's wrist. "Promise me again." Lucian exhaled slowly. Then, he did something no Alpha would ever do before war. He reached up and pressed his forehead against Elijah's. "I swear it," he whispered. "I will come back to you." Then he was gone. Elijah stood at the window, watching him disappear into the battlefield. His chest ached. And then, something inside him snapped. Because he realized, he couldn't just wait. Not anymore. Chapter 22. The War Begins. The battlefield was a blur of clashing steel, flashing teeth, and blood. Lucian fought at the front line, a force of pure destruction. His claws tore through enemies, his sword stained crimson. But there were too many. And then, he felt it. A sharp, slicing pain in his side. Lucian stumbled, his vision blurring for a second. A rogue wolf lunged for him, but before it could strike, a dagger flew through the air, straight into the wolf's skull. Lucian's head snapped up in shock. And there, standing at the edge of the battlefield, was Elijah. His eyes were blazing, his stance firm. "What the hell?" Lucian's voice was hoarse. Elijah didn't wait. He ran straight into the fight. Lucian cursed. Then he did the only thing he could. He fought his way to Elijah's side. Chapter 23. The Turning Point. Fighting together was chaos. Elijah wasn't an Omega, but he moved like he belonged here. His agility made him impossible to catch. His daggers found every weakness. Lucian couldn't decide whether to be furious or terrified. "Elijah, you—" Lucian's words were cut off as an enemy came too close. Elijah spun, and before Lucian could react, he took the hit meant for him. Lucian saw it happen in slow motion. The blade cut into Elijah's shoulder, and he staggered. His breath hitched, but his eyes never wavered. Lucian lost control. The second Elijah was hurt, something inside him snapped. His vision darkened, his body moving on pure instinct. In that moment, Lucian was no longer an alpha. He was just a mate, one who refused to lose the person he loved. Chapter 24. The Aftermath. By the time the battle ended, Lucian was covered in blood, sweat, and fury. But none of it mattered. Only Elijah did. Lucian carried him back to camp, his grip tight, unrelenting. Elijah was conscious, but barely. The wound on his shoulder wasn't fatal. But that didn't matter to Lucian. The moment they were alone, he pressed his forehead to Elijah's. "You could have died," Lucian said, voice shaking. "Why would you do something so reckless?" Elijah's lips twitched. "Because I love you, idiot." Lucian's breath caught. He pulled back just enough to meet Elijah's gaze. The words were so simple, but they hit him harder than any wound ever could. Elijah reached up, fingers sliding into Lucian's hair. "I love you," he repeated, softer this time. "And I don't regret it." Lucian exhaled sharply. Then he kissed him. Desperately. Fiercely. Because Elijah was his. And Lucian would never let him go again. Chapter 25. The Unbreakable Bond. The war was over. The pack accepted Elijah. The council was silent. Lucian and Elijah stood at the edge of the village, watching the sunset. Lucian reached out, threading his fingers through Elijah's. "Oh. What now?" Elijah smirked. "Now. You owe me." Lucian raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For almost getting me killed." Lucian sighed. "I think you have that backwards." Elijah hummed. Then, suddenly, he pulled Lucian down into a kiss. Not desperate this time. Not rushed. Just them. Lucian held him close, never wanting to let go. Because, finally, they were exactly where they were meant to be. Together. Forever.